In America, yellow is made margin, but in our hands, this hue becomes testimony. Threads pulled across ocean and land, fingerprints pressed into earth, stories sealed in amber, enduring outside the halls of power, gleaming with the quiet persistence of what refuses to be erased. In my process, I typically begin with poetry. At the time, I was thinking a lot about the color yellow as someone who has inherited legacies of sustenance and erasure. And I am thinking very much about, as a Thai American, how I can meditate on this color. Obviously, the significance of it as an Asian American, and especially an East Asian presenting Asian American. My dad is Thai, my mom is Indo-Chinese, so I look just like my grandma. You know, in the United States, yellow has been used very much as a chromatic slur. So I'm thinking about, you know, how we can expand the meaning and the significance of yellow and kind of call back to how I know this color, these mustards, these ochres that I grew up with in the kitchens of my dad's restaurant, seeing in, you know, the salt fields as you fly overhead in Phetchaburi, or, you know, the color of rice fields right before harvest. They're just golden and beautiful and kind of full of life. And to me, yellow is the color of sustenance. It's the color of endurance. It's the color of resilience. Because I've seen legacies in my own family, but also throughout history, Asian American history, how we have reclaimed and how we have come together and gathered and reminded ourselves of all of these stories and legacies that exist beyond the realm of power and empire. In my process, I typically want stories to be communal. So I often invite friends or community members to help me curate or source items and objects. Sometimes they are gifted, so they're sort of like talismans of all the lives that they've lived before, and they hold all of these memories and all these moments of home. These vessels, they carry memories, objects, us, and also items of nourishment. So you see baskets, you see, you know, things that are woven and hold other things. But the forms that I use in these works should remind you of, like, for example, katomat, or like gyo, or, you know, just like these like little sachets of nourishment that you might see at the market, that you might, you know, create, you know, at home. You might make at home. These works, they really sort of like hold the spirit of care and nourishment, because that is what I hope to kind of remind people of when they think about ochres, when they think about mustards, when they think about yellow. I'm a restaurant kid. When my dad immigrated to the United States, you know, he spent 10 years working his way up from being a dishwasher to finally opening his own Thai restaurant. So I grew up in those kitchens, which meant that I learned how to show care through my hands through growing up, you know, around all that cooking. It's an ecosystem of aunties and community members who taught me how to show love through the things that I made with my hands. And, you know, I just have all of these memories of, you know, peeling garlic, or just being around all of this, you know, heat and labor and sweat and spice, and all of that, I think, sits in parallel with my practice today as a contemporary artist, because I come from a long legacy of people who have used their hands to care for their community or community members. So, you know, ancestors who were fishermen and farmers and, of course, cooks. And now as an artist who, you know, often sews with her hands instead of using the machine, handwork, like hand sewing, things that are created by our hands are inherently imperfect. And because they are imperfect, they are so beautiful because they reflect such an honest depiction of humanity. You know, I look at my practice as kind of creating these ecosystems of reciprocity, and I hope that wherever I am invited to or have the privilege to do work, that, you know, I can build community there. You know, I miss my assistants so much. I had 6 working on the ground floor in 2023, and we still keep in touch. And, you know, I think it's so important to kind of not only root work in a place, but with the people who help you create it. You know, I'm typically drawn to creating really large works because it's very physical. You know, I think I'm often inviting audiences into embodied experiences, works in the public realm, because they're so large in scale, you can sort of like walk through them and in them, and it's how we inspire awe and wonder, and that is it's a legacy and an opportunity that everyone deserves. However, it is also really, really wonderful to be able to create more discrete works that are at a smaller scale because the experience is more intimate. And, you know, I invite everyone to just spend time here because that is what's necessary to kind of really see the labor in these works and also see the layers of meaning and the layers of depth. Like, of course, there is softness in these works. They're textile works. But there's also a deep sense of power in them too, that kind of calls back to humble labor and, you know, takes you to places like rice fields, like rivers, even the streets of Bangkok. Like, I was just walking down the street the other day and there was this building that actually had, you know, insulation exposed, and it was actually the color of my artworks. And I feel like these works really just depict how I see this place, which is kind of a juxtaposition of growth and decay. It's sort of like an outpouring of care and also jungle in such an urban setting as well. And you can kind of see all of these threads entwine and combine into these works that really speak to home, that speak to migration, that speak to diasporic identity and kind of the suspension that I live between worlds. Neuroscience taught me how significant memory is and how it lives in the body, how it lives in ourselves, how it is epigenetic and always present. There's a book called The Body Keeps Score, and it's basically about how trauma lives in the body. In all of the ethnographic research that I do, I see it present in our conversations. And beyond that, I think all of my work kind of is with and for community members because of the research that I did early on. So we were studying aging, we were studying how we age gracefully. You know, we all want to know, right? How do we age and also have our mental faculties intact? And what was very interesting was that it's actually the strength of our community ties that determines how we age. So it actually inspired me to stop being a scientist and actually cultivate community by creating art, because I think art it's a bridge, right? It allows people to, you know, access parts of themselves that they might, you know, be hiding or might feel closed to. And then when they see a work of art, when they engage with dialogue with an artist or with artworks, then they're able to sort of like slowly kind of enter these other pieces and parts of themselves and hopefully kind of knit and mend those parts of themselves together. And I think that's very much in juxtaposition to how I create, which is that I'm trying to knit together all these disparate parts of myself. Because with diasporic identity, you do feel isolation and separation from your roots. And especially being mixed Asian American, you know, it's sort of like Thai community, Chinese community, Indonesian community, you know, being American as well, right? You're trying to knit all of these parts of yourself together with threads that kind of like root back generations. My practice spans sculpture, painting, and also textile works, but I think recently I've very much been drawn to textile works because textiles are almost like second skin. You know, it's the first thing that touches us when we come into this world, and we're wrapped in it when we leave. So it's always with us in the same way that memory is always with us and kind of touches our lives in different ways. Textiles in particular, they just offer a medium that is very rich for me and that relates almost kind of very deeply with memory. And, you know, when I was doing ethnographic research and traveling all over Thailand and basically living and studying with meme in, you know, all over Thailand, I saw such an outpouring of care and compassion in the way that they work that just not only inspired me deeply as a human, but inspired my process as well. So, you know, I try to carry all the things that they taught me, namely how we can collectively create something beautiful and how beauty is actually a vessel for survival into how I create today. But also, I think there's something really deeply beautiful about weaving. There are things that are sort of like hidden and also visible at the same time. And I think that is very human. There are things that we hide, and there are histories that are hidden that we're wanting to bring into the light, but they aren't always visible, and sort of like we have to work to find those parts that are sort of like go under. Textiles have such a softness to them that I'm hoping to actually recontextualize as powerful, because I think so often we think of things that are soft as not powerful, but I think they coexist because I've seen it, you know, in all of my teachers in these rural communities, in, you know, the aunties and the women in my life, how they hold both softness and power at once. I definitely learned hyper-specific techniques that you certainly see in the works, like, you know, those like little mini pillows, learned that in the North. So there are certainly techniques that I incorporate and evolve and modify as an homage to my teachers. I've always sewn because growing up I danced. So we have to sew your own point shoes, right? So it's like kind of functional. Like I didn't actually see it as sort of like a way to communicate labor. Because like 1 million stitches in work, right? You start to kind of like really think about kind of the labor of that and the amount of time that it takes to create works like this, especially by hand. So I think, you know, in part, that's also why I use, you know, hand sewing in my works, because it forces audiences to contend with the time and the labor spent. And it helps them kind of relate that to unseen labor in their own lives. For example, you know, the people who kind of clean our facilities, or the folks who are driving buses, or, you know, any place where there's labor that's overlooked, the people who grow our food and harvest it, all of those areas where, you know, we may not be thinking so hard about it because we live in such a quick and convenient world. But I hope that these works kind of bring you back to sort of like the roots of harvest and labor, so that we can think more deeply about how we spend time and how time can be a proxy for care, because we're not spending a lot of time on things that we don't care about, right? So maybe then we think about, you know, where am I spending my time? Should I be thinking more about, you know, cultivating community, my relationship with the natural world? Probably, because, you know, we are in a climate crisis. I think sewing and weaving will always be a part of my practice. I think, you know, my experience living and working with these artisans in rural textile communities was so transformative for me. I think it just left an indelible mark that will always be with me. So I think I'll always want to kind of like honor their contribution to culture and living heritage, and it'll always be part of my practice. I may be adapting techniques and sort of like shifting forms and ways in which I use weaving and sewing in my work, but I think it'll always be there.